Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. It's great to be with you with Information Countermeasures. My name is Ali Mellon. I'm a security strategist. I've been in tech for the past 10 years. I'm a computer engineer by training, and I've spent a lot of time doing a lot of various engineering and tech roles over that 10 years, but more recently, I've been working in the security space. I've presented my research at places like Black Hat and DEF CON and HOPE, and now Secure WB. And over the past 2 years in particular, I've been working very closely with the FBI, Secret Service, DHS, and local and state law enforcement in order to test the security of our elections in order to make it better. And so this has been done through tabletop exercises where we put hackers against law enforcement and government officials in order to really see what processes are in place and how effective they are. So it's not a lot of hands-on hacking, but it's actually looking at the processes that the government has in place, seeing how prepared they are, and seeing if what different things attackers could do that they might not be prepared for. And this is all about the things that are really surrounding the election. It's not so much limited to just those voting machines, but really what else can someone do to suppress the vote or to affect the election. But before we really dive into that, I want to start by talking about what's truly critical to our daily lives, because it's really way more connected than we think. And of course, the first thing that we think of when we think of what's critical to our daily life is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a pyramid that represents all of the things that we as individuals need in order to achieve self-actualization and really that ability to be the best that we can be. At the bottom layer, you have the physiological needs. These are things like air, water, food, the really important things that you need just to be a human being. On the next level, we have safety. This is things like personal security, employment, and resources. You really can't achieve the top of that pyramid without safety. Next, and this one is critical, comes to belonging. Things like friendship and intimacy, really that sense of connection that you have with others in the community and others in the world. Above that is esteem, of course, that self-respect, that respect from others, status and recognition. And again, all of this is leading up to self-actualization. And you can't have self-actualization without all of these other layers of the pyramid. So where does voting fit into this? Why is this important in the context of voting? That's what we're going to talk about, but more, I want to break down things like the defender perspective and the daily life of a voter, as well as diving into what the attacker perspective really looks like, so we can take that information and think about it in the context of what you could do to both stop an election and how we can use that to protect an election, because that's what's really important. And that's what we're looking to get out of both of these exercises that I've done, but also as individuals, how can we contribute to election security? So let's dive into the defender perspective, get a good overview of how we got here and what that looks like, so that we can really understand how we can best attack that. So according to the DHS, election infrastructure includes all of the things like voter registration databases, associated IT systems, voting systems, polling places, all of these things that are really about counting the votes. But what I am thinking of as I think of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs is that really all that there is to ensuring election security? And I don't think that it is. In fact, I think that much more than that, we need to consider what I call the voter hierarchy of needs. And this is really a pyramid of things that are critical for individual citizens before they feel comfortable voting. And it aligns really closely to Maslow's hierarchy of needs in order to show the real connection that voting has and people's willingness to vote has with the existing systems that are related to their daily lives. So it starts with things like the physiological needs. Of course, we're talking about if you don't feel safe, if you feel like your life is at risk because you don't have enough food, for example, you're much less likely to make the decision to go out and vote. Similarly, if you don't feel safe, if you feel at risk because someone is trying to hurt you, or for example, you don't feel financially secure, you have other priorities that may be more important than going to vote. Another great example, a really important example that we're seeing time and time again be really critical to people actually choosing to go vote, is belonging. And it's really all about that belief system. And it's also about feeling like you belong in the community and like you have a connection to the country that you are a part of. And then, of course, esteem, feeling like your vote matters, feeling like you have a voice in the country that you are in. And ultimately leading to self-actualization. And we're talking about self-actualization not just for yourself, but for your country as well. You want your country to be the best it can be when you feel that sense of belonging, when you feel connected to the country that you're in. So all of these are critical in order to really make sure that individual citizens feel compelled to go vote, feel safe going to vote, and are not able to be suppressed by another group of people. So this is why when I think about election infrastructure, I think that having a narrow definition that really just encompasses the physical infrastructure associated with actually collecting the votes is far too limited. And that's not to say that governments or election committees should be in charge of a bunch of other facets that contribute to this, but they should be thinking about it. They should have a plan in place. They should have partners associated with it so that they're more prepared to handle these types of election threats. Because all of these layers, these become systems that we really need to protect in order to ensure the integrity of the vote, because they are all layers that can be a target. And we're going to go through all of these different layers actually to see different ways that you can attack these layers in order to affect an election. And it's particularly stark when you see that 40% of eligible US citizens choose not to vote at all. We're already down 40% of people. So any bit of election interference or any bit of election meddling or tampering can have a really large impact when you're already missing so much of the vote. So when I think about election infrastructure, I'm really thinking about three core elements. Things like maintaining faith in democracy, which is critical for nations that support the vote. The second is all about preventing voter suppression, which could be done on a domestic or international scale, depending. And the third, national security, because again, if you don't feel safe, if you feel like your life is at risk because another country is interfering with your election, you're most likely not going to go vote. You're going to start to see a crumbling of people's belief in the country and willingness to contribute to the country. So now I want to dive into the attacker perspective. Now that we have that point of view, and really, I want you guys to start brainstorming as well what the attacker perspective might look like in the modern day, given what you know about our election system, given how you go to vote. And I want to emphasize that this isn't evil. And I think that a lot of us know that, a lot of us in the security space, which I'm pretty sure is most of the people here, we know that this isn't evil. We know that this is why we red team. This is what's so important, is that we're able to understand the attacker mindset so that we can really use that to make the systems that we have in place better. So please keep in mind as we go through this that there's no need to demonize people who do look for what threats could be effective, because really it is just meant to make us stronger. So when we're thinking about the attacker, they typically have three motivations. The first is, of course, to gain power. a lot of, especially at the nation state level, these are going to be the 3 core ones that we're thinking about, with the second being spreading a particular ideology. We saw this a lot during the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. And we'll get into some of that a little bit later. And then the last is really maintaining that global recognition and support. We see a lot of countries using attacks on people's elections and attacks on their government in order to really maintain their global recognition and support, especially as a superpower. When I think about attacks, specifically cyber attacks to anything, whether it's elections or not, I think about them in 3 different layers. The first is the infrastructure layer. That's all the physical components that people are actually attacking. This is what makes a cyber attack have a kinetic impact. The second is that information plane. This is really playing off of what people know to be true, giving them quote unquote facts that aren't true, whether you do it intentionally or not. And the last is the ethos plane. This is targeting that belief system. This is where we really start to see things like democracy, things like governments, and the foundations that they're built on start to crumble. When people target the actual belief system of a country, the belief system of the individuals, and turn these individuals against the government or against the community. So I want to start by looking at some historical examples of attacks on that belief system plane. And we're going to look at some that don't have a cyber component as well as those that do. And what's important to note here is that even though some of the historical examples don't have a cyber component, they very easily could in modern day. The only reason that they don't is because they're from so long ago. And there wasn't the option then. So when you think about this, another great thing to think about as we go through these is how much easier these types of attacks would be if people had access to the internet at the time. Because that's what we're really getting at here, is that these attacks are not new. They're just they're in a new package, and the package is the internet. So I want to start with the Italian elections of 1948. In 1948, the US government and the Soviet Union was intent on psychological warfare. The US was, of course, really pushing democracy. They were spending millions of dollars, both on Christian democratic parties, but also on the Soviet Union side, really pushing the right-wing socialist agenda. There was a massive propaganda campaign against the Communist Socialist Coalition. And the goal on both sides was to really change the perception of the election, even though these 2 countries are not supposed to be involved with the country's politics. But they really wanted to change the conversation into a battle of democracy versus totalitarianism, Christianity versus atheism, America versus the Soviet Union, and ultimately what they really wanted is a conversation about abundance versus starvation. And what was amazing is this was so effective that they ultimately repeated the process in Guatemala, in South Vietnam, in Afghanistan, and Indonesia, and many more. Another example I want to talk about is the 1996 Chinese influence on the US election. Now, in 1996, a Chinese general interested in influencing the US presidential election funneled $300,000 to the Clinton campaign. Now, immediately you think, well, this money is funneled to the Clinton campaign because they want the Clinton campaign to win. Absolutely. However, there's more to it than that, because ultimately US citizens did find out about this, and this is the type of thing that makes people start to lose faith in their government and belief that their votes and their money and their choices are what are deciding elections in this country. So now I want to take a look at some modern day examples. We're going to look at examples from 2016, and I'm sure in a few weeks I'll have a lot from this year for you. But let's take a look at some social media examples. On the right, you can see a like and share if you want the burqa banned in America. Stop all invaders. This is a Facebook ad, a Facebook post that's promoted, and it's really meant to push this narrative of there's conflict in the United States. We have invaders, quote unquote, in America, and this is someone who feels that way who is American. However, the reality looks very different. This is not a site that is, or a group that is actually a group of Americans. This is a group of people who is looking to spread disinformation in the country and to cause chaos and ultimately conflict. On the left, you can see a great example as well from Twitter, which is supposedly a very helpful notice from the Clinton campaign saying, vote from home, text Hillary to this number, and you'll be able to vote. Now, this could be a very compelling message to a lot of people, especially right now when tensions are high. You don't necessarily want to do mail-in voting. You don't necessarily want to go into the polls because of the pandemic. There's a lot of confusion and conflict caused by this. And so having a texting option would be very convenient. It looks very official. It has Hillary on it. It has her campaign logo in the corner. But in reality, this is not an actual way to vote, of course. It's not a way that you can vote. It is from someone who is obviously trying to mess with people and trying to make sure that certain people's votes don't count. And luckily, we have seen over the past few months, many social media companies start to step up in some capacity to address these problems. However, we still have quotes like these from some where they're talking about how this is a free speech issue and how this is not something that they can control because they don't want to police individuals on their platforms. However, one thing that I hope will become clear throughout the course of this talk is that election security is everyone's problem. It is not just the government's problem. It is not just businesses' problems. It's not just social media companies' problems. It is for a problem for all of us to address, and we need to do what we know is right and what we know is the most reasonable and beneficial way to approach the situation. And framing this as a free speech issue is not benefiting the community and the country that you're a part of. And I don't mean to say that we should oppress certain groups or not talk about what certain groups are saying, but we need a solution that addresses fake information being put out there, and we need it at the business level. We need it at the government level. We need it at the individual level. We need to work together to find a better solution. So let's dive into the information plane. And this is all of those things that, those fake, fake comments you see online, those fake videos that get posted online. And I want to start with a historical example that's personally really important to me because I didn't even know about it for a long time. You certainly didn't hear this growing up, but the foundations of America. And that really starts with Sam Adams, which is crazy to think about. But ultimately, America was founded on the premise of a conspiracy theory where the British were trying to enslave us. Sam Adams argued Britain's taxations were part of an elaborate conspiracy to eventually enslave American colonists. He actually spread that and other early disinformation through pamphlets and speeches that had information that he knew was untrue. And he actually used the Boston Massacre to further that message. So when we think about disinformation and we talk about it in the context of oh, this is being spread so quickly through social media, in reality, this is not a new problem. This is a human problem. And this is something that we've seen for as long as the country that I'm a part of has been here, and probably much longer. And so instead of thinking about it as this is a problem with social media's virality, or this is a problem with people posting things without having to back them up, we need to think about this as the actual human problem that it is. Another great example, and this one I actually find very interesting, is the CIA and the propaganda asset inventory. So in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, during the Cold War era, we saw the CIA have a massive propaganda asset inventory. They had so many newspapers and radio stations and all of magazines, all of those different things that they were using to spread propaganda across the world. And I'm going to call out two specific examples that I think are very interesting. The first being Radio Free Asia. So Radio Free Asia was a radio station controlled by the CIA that was used to spread propaganda, specifically targeting different Asian countries. And at the time, they realized that the average citizen of Taiwan probably did not have a radio because it wasn't something that had taken hold in that area yet. They weren't technologically there, the whole 9 yards. So what they did to address that problem was they strapped balloons with small radios and tried to fly them over to Taiwan. Needless to say, that did not work. The wind changed direction and took them away. But it's an interesting example of how before we had really the internet that we do today, they were trying to get propaganda to these people, to get disinformation to these people ultimately. The second one that I find really interesting is a magazine called The Forum World Features. This was a magazine, again, where the CIA was placing propaganda articles. Unfortunately, the magazine became so popular that it was also distributed to the US ultimately. And so the CIA had to be very careful not to place false stories in the US version, only in the other versions. So two very interesting stories about how the logistics that go behind trying to put disinformation in the areas that will benefit the country that you're working for. Another great example is the US radio in Moscow. From 1976 to 1982, rock music was really popular in Russia, but not very accessible. And the only way that you could get it was through a radio station controlled by the CIA. And they would play rock music like Elton John and the Beatles, and they would follow it up with editorial content, quote unquote, which Soviet authorities considered disinformation. But it was the only station that people in Moscow could get rock music on, and so they continued to listen. Now, I want to give a more recent example from Ukraine, from the 2014 elections in Ukraine. Now, these elections were highly contested. On the 21st of May in 2014, this is about 4 days before the election, attackers actually were able to compromise the CEC network, which is the election commission network in Ukraine, and they disabled the vote counting on that network. So automatically, this can make people really start to lose faith in their government, of course, and in their election. What they did next, even though, that compromise, it made the network go down for about 12 hours. But 4 days later, on election day, because that was really just the start, the attackers started a continuous denial of service attack on that same CEC website. And 12 minutes before polls closed, the attackers actually posted a picture of the former leader of the right sector on the CEC website, which is an official website, claiming that this person won the election. And that was then shared widely and immediately by Russian media. So this is fascinating because, to me especially, because it really feels like a combination of different ways to attack a target. Of course, a few days before the election, you start to really degrade their faith in the election, but then the day of, you not only make it very difficult for them to actually use the website, but you publish disinformation on this official website just 12 minutes before the polls close. And then you use what I think most people attribute to the Russians. You use your own your own media networks in order to share that information as well and give it even more validity. And now I want to give some examples of communications attacks, which really, again, target that information plane. And two examples come in the form of text messages. This is again from the US presidential election in 2016. On the right, we have an example of how an individual citizen is receiving a text message from someone claiming to be associated with government, and it says, you vote at this, this address, and the hours to go vote are 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. Needless to say, this is not a legitimate polling place. It's not even a place that you can go vote. So imagine being a citizen and getting this message that, oh, how convenient, the government is helping me get to vote tomorrow and they're giving me the address, I don't even have to look it up. But it's not actually a polling place. And you go there and you see that it's shut down, it's not an actual polling place, you're gonna be frustrated. You're not necessarily gonna want to go and find the actual polling place. And then on the left, you have an example that's supposedly from President Trump saying, you haven't submitted your ballot yet, submit it here. This is not a message from President Trump or his campaign or anything like that, but it is meant to shame people into going to vote for a particular candidate. Lastly, we're going to talk about infrastructure plane attacks. And these I find the most fascinating because it really does have the potential to impact our physical realm through a cyber attack. But again, we'll start with some historical examples and work our way to real life. I want to start with the assassination of Lumumba. This was in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The DRC was actually made an independent nation in 1960, and the person that they actually elected as prime minister was Lumumba. So they elected him in 1960. They became an independent nation in 1960, but then he was assassinated 1 year later in 1961. Now, having your brand new prime minister in your brand new nation be assassinated would be politically fracturing for any new country. But it's made even more so by the fact that he was actually assassinated by a combination of American and Belgian governments working together to assassinate him because it didn't meet to their interests. Now, imagine that you are part of a brand new country. You're voting for the first time as this comparably very small country to a lot of countries in the world. And the person that you chose to run your country is assassinated a year later by two superpowers. These are the types of things that can really fracture a new nation and really make them feel like their votes don't even matter, because ultimately they're not the ones in control. Another example is the Indonesian elections and subsequent massacre. So in 1965, the Communist Party finished fourth in an Indonesian elections, and they were offered a proportional representation in the government. Now, this did not fit with US interests, and so they actually secretly supported the purge of suspected communists, and thousands to millions of people died over the course of months. Ultimately, the military took over as the most powerful institution. Now, this is the type of thing that obviously it kills people on a massive scale, but it also terrifies the public. Who is voting freely after this happens in their country? Who is speaking freely about their beliefs after this happens in their country? And this was all through consistent communication on the part of the US to actual members of this country, and consistently making them feel like the rest of the country was with them, like they needed to purge the communists. It was all through a massive disinformation campaign. Another example, a more recent example, is the Bronze Night. Though not on election day, it's a very good example of what could happen and what has happened. So the Bronze Night is a night in Estonia in 2007 when the Estonians decided to move a Red Army soldier to a Soviet cemetery because it was previously in the center of a town. They didn't want it there anymore for obvious reasons. Now, immediately as they started to move this statue, fake news began to spread, especially with Russian news reports. They were all claiming that the statue and the Soviet war graves were being destroyed en masse. This resulted in 2 nights of riots and looting. 156 people were injured, 1 person died, and 1,000 people were detained, which is horrible in and of itself. But simultaneously, banks, media outlets, and the government was hit by a denial of service attack. It actually was so effective that cash machines were unusable. Online banking was completely out of service. Government employees were unable to communicate through email, and the newspapers and broadcasters were unable to deliver the news. So the only news coming in was through these fake Russian news reports. This is a great example of how you can really combine an infrastructure attack with a disinformation campaign in order to ultimately cause a lot more confusion and chaos and damage. But what's also really important about this is you're able to do this in such a way where you stay below the level of an armed attack and you can't necessarily say who or like attribute them to one person. It's attribution is so difficult with cyber attacks. So even though you may suspect one group, you can't say this is an act of war because, again, most of it, to your knowledge, is your people. Excuse me. So let's talk about some potential attacks that could happen on the electric grid. In 2003, a 4-day power outage left at least 100 people in the United States and Canada dead. Imagine a scenario where a power outage was caused by a cyber attack. This is the type of thing that, as we've seen, could kill people. But in addition, if that happens on election day, you're much less likely going to go to vote because you have other things to worry about, like if what's in your fridge is going bad, or if your parents are okay, if your siblings are okay. A lot of people have a lot of things to worry about when an entire city's power goes out. And voting automatically becomes less of a priority because of something like this happening. And it can cause a lot of division as well, because if it happens in certain districts or certain areas, it can seem like intentional sabotage. The second is transit. Now, in 2016, San Francisco's transit system was infected with ransomware. I want you to imagine a day, an election day, where we are thankfully out of this lockdown, back going into the office. You take the train into work, you say that you're going to vote after work, you go into the office and you have a normal work day. Maybe you go on Twitter during lunch, you scroll past some disinformation, hopefully you don't share it, and then you make it to the end of the day and you go to get back on the train to go vote, and the train is shut down. It's not working. What are you going to be thinking about in that moment? Are you going to be thinking about how you get to the polling place? Or are you going to be thinking about how annoyed you are and how much you want to just go home and relax? And how you have to pay for that Uber instead of just taking the train, which you already have a pass for. These are the types of situations that can cause people to either just choose not to vote or not have the time to vote or the ability to go vote. And we can see that these types of attacks are really across all layers, both in the infrastructure, information, and ethos planes, but also all layers of the pyramid. And when you're thinking about this, like these are just a few examples, but think about all the other possibilities in your daily life that this could affect. And I want to dive back into the defender perspective now that we have this point of view on what different attacks could actually be perpetrated. So where does the current system leave us? Right now, we have this very limited definition of election security. We're talking about, again, databases, IT infrastructure, the actual polling place itself. And here's what we've got. We have quotes like these where top government officials are saying we cannot exclude such activities. For example, in Germany, we have quotes from presidents, tweets from presidents saying that the election is a scam. We have quotes from congressional Democrats saying that they're deeply concerned about disinformation that's going to be used to influence the presidential election. And while these are not necessarily bad quotes, because at least they're referencing what's going on, they don't offer a solution. There is no, okay, here's the situation and here's what you as an individual should be doing right now. This is just a statement of fact. And that is where we are at right now, is there's no comprehensive solution that's thinking about this. So where should we really be going? What do we need to be thinking about in order to actually make our elections more secure, in order to make sure that these type of attacks aren't as impactful as they are right now? And the answer is really we need a broader definition of what election security really is. It needs to take into account the things that really affect voters' both willingness and ability to turn out, as well as their faith in their country, because that is so critical to making sure that people vote. And I've included a few examples based on what we've talked about today, but there are others as well that are not being taken into account here. And I'm sure that you guys can think of some when you think about what your typical day of voting looks like. And I want you to think about that so that you can think about how you can defend it better. Like, what do you do on election day? Do you vote before work? I know that right now, for example, a lot of people are using mail-in ballots, which I'm a big proponent of, even though it's taking so long in some states, and that's exhausting. But what's important is think about what you do in a normal day. Think about if you're fact checking everything that you're posting. Think about how modern events can change how you choose to vote. One of the pluses of early voting and of mail-in ballots is a lot of these time-based attacks that are really limited to that election day are now not as effective because we have so many people who are able to vote before the actual election day. But of course, things like early voting and mail-in ballots, everything has its own threat model. We just have to figure out what is going to reduce risk effectively. So when you think about what your election day looks like or looked like this year, think about it in the context of an attack. How would you attack each level of this pyramid? How does each level of this pyramid really affect your willingness to go vote? And use that information to think about what change we need to drive, both at the government level, but also as individuals, as organizations. Think about how we need to change our current systems, how we need to adapt to face this threat. And ultimately, how do we actually defend each one of these? Because as I mentioned earlier, it is not the government's job to make sure that no disinformation is being posted on social media sites, or to make sure that the electric grid isn't hit by a cyber attack necessarily, because some are privately held. But what is important is building partnerships with these groups, considering how this could impact the election and communicating that to these companies. So when we think about what we can really do to protect democracy, I want us to think about things like, first off, securing your systems as an individual and at work, whether you work for the government or not. Because ultimately, if you are a part of an organization that's a critical infrastructure provider, you are most likely a very good target when someone is trying to affect the outcome of an election or to cause a breakdown within a government. This, and as an individual, of course you are as well. The second thing I recommend is to work with the government. There are a lot of great organizations out there that allow you to work with the government. One is InfraGard. I'm a member of InfraGard. I'm a huge supporter of that group. Find ways to partner with the government so that you can go to them and say, hey, I'm worried about election day. I think that my company could have an issue on election day because of XYZ, and I want to open a communications channel with you so that if something happens, we can have a process in place to address it. And then the last is to fight disinformation as much as possible. And this can be many forms. Ultimately, it's about being a trusted and kind resource to those around you, especially when they're sharing disinformation. If one of your friends or family members is spreading disinformation, the best thing that you can do is try to understand their point of view and then be there to communicate the reality of the situation. Because there's a reason that they're communicating and sharing what they're communicating. And it's because it's deeply tied to their emotional state. And it agrees with what they feel emotionally. And you're not going to get anywhere by trying to shame someone out of believing in disinformation. The best thing that you can do is be there and just, it's constant work. It's constant effort of trying to make sure that they understand the reality of the situation in a way that they feel safe. So I have written a white paper on this, and it is totally free to download, whatever you like. Just go to that URL, and it's all about everything that we discussed here today. So just some more reading for you if you're interested. And I want to thank you guys so much for attending my talk. If you have any questions at all, I'm here. I'm happy to take some now as well. You can also find me on Twitter at HackerBella.
Thanks a lot, Allie. That was a interesting talk. I do have a question.
Yeah.
I mean, you and I both bank online every day, and we trust the bank to handle our banking transactions over the internet. Do you ever see a point to where we'll be voting like that?
I do. I think it's very immature, and it is many, many years away. Like probably, I hope it's 15 to 20 minimum. It would be very beneficial in order to get people access to vote more, but things like what happened in Iowa, which wasn't even affected by a cyber attack, are very scary. And I think the way that I like to talk about this is there's a culture clash between the tech space and the government space. So basically, when you think about it, tech, they have to move fast, they have to build features, and they have to get features out because they have to win against the competition. Government is very different. Government is about, especially when it comes to elections, they have to build a robust system that's going to maintain the integrity of the count, that's going to keep the ballots confidential, and that's going to be very reliable. And so when we try to use new technology, or even sometimes old technology, within a government setting, there's just a huge culture clash between the two. And until we get that figured out, until we can really make the tech more robust, we're just not going to be able to use it in that way.
There was a pilot program here in West Virginia that was specifically geared to a very small population of people, and that was active duty military members that are from residents in West Virginia. And what the Secretary of State here did was they pushed out an app to those people to allow them to vote through the app. Now, of course, you know, that's a very small group of people, you know, less than 1,000. So, you know, there was no way that SpongeBob SquarePants was going to get elected governor because, you know, nobody was going to be able to spoof, you know, tens of thousands of votes because they knew that there were only going to be this X number. But that test was very successful here.
That's awesome. I'm glad to hear that. I think that those types of small tests are the best way to start moving towards that, you know, and really like to experiment with portions of the population. The thing that scares me is when they're like, we're just going to roll this out for an entire state or for an entire country. and there just hasn't been the testing that we really need in order to make sure that that's safe.
Let me check Discord here to see if there's anybody has any questions. No, I don't see any. Allie, we really thank you for your time and your talk, and we appreciate you coming to Secure WV. Hopefully next year you can come back and maybe we'll get to be in person. But
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It was great to be here and enjoy the rest of the conference.